Sounds good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth training session on the BJA STOP School Violence Grant Program. In the last training, we talked in depth on best practices in developing a logic model to use as a framework and roadmap for your Stop School Violence program. You were also tasked with the assignment of completing this logic model. In today's training, we'll move from the logic model to the project design and implementation section of the narrative. We'll talk about how to break projects down into much more detail in order to craft quality narrative. I will cover the requirements and key elements that need to be addressed, including those within each of the deliverable areas we've discussed in previous presentations. Along the way, I'll provide practical tips and tools, including a work plan that will help you in crafting a high-quality, compelling proposal and project narrative section. So you can see on this slide the weight of each section for the scoring and review criteria, which we discussed in the second training covering the solicitation. We're going to talk today really again about the project design and implementation section of the narrative, as it is one of the most heavily weighted sections of the proposal. The project design and implementation section demonstrates to the reviewer whether or not the applicant has a well thought out plan that has a high likelihood of achieving success. The project design section of the narrative will follow your needs section and the project goals and objectives section. Think of it as something like, okay, if this is the problem, here are the solutions we are proposing, which are your goals and objectives, of course, and then here's how we're going to do it, which is then your project design and implementation section. This section will address the fundamental questions we briefly discussed in our last session, which leads me to our work plan slide. We talk about things like the who, what, when, where, why, and how. You're essentially going to break down the activities of your logic model into much more detail. One of the tools I like to use here to help guide teams through this process is this work plan. You'll also receive this handout of a blank work plan at the end of today's session. The work plan is really much more of a zoomed in view of the activities, which is the detail needed for the program design section of the narrative. And you can see this in the columns. So in addition to the activity, you want to list the person responsible for conducting the activity, the quarter and fiscal year in which it will be completed, the resources required to implement the activity, and the performance indicator that you will collect to measure your project's performance. This should directly relate to your project's goals and deliverables. When I use work plans with teams, I like to start with what and how. What will be done and how will it be done? What activities will you do that you believe will lead to the outcomes and ultimately to the goal? How are you going to do it? What are the methods that are going to be used? What evidence do you have that it will be successful in your district, with your students, with your target population? I'll explain more later on how you can find that these programs and practices will be effective. But what to look for here, it's important to know that you do want to be thinking about the evidence-based practices and stating them in your narrative and the specific steps that you need to implement the activity as well as the evidence-based practices and how it's applicable to your school, your students, your needs, and your project. Make sure you're also involving community stakeholders and partners, including staff, students, and families, as we've discussed in previous sessions. I then like to ask teams, okay, what resources are needed to do each of these activities, which is on the right end of this table. So do they need materials like an evidence-based curriculum or assessment to implement this program? Or do they need to bring in an expert trainer and conduct trainings for their staff? Do they need additional staff to help implement these activities? You can see asking these types of questions on what resources are needed helps to start informing the budget. Very quickly, you can start to create a budget outline here with your resources needed and see if you have too many activities, which cost too much for the budget allowed. And then think about who will conduct the activity. This may also lead to identifying partners or external resources that might be needed, which then again is also going to inform your budget, as well as informing things like letters of support and MOUs. In addition to who will conduct the activity, think about who will participate in the activity and make sure you are describing the individuals who will be involved in these activities. Next is timing. When will the activity be conducted? What is the frequency and length of time for each training? What is the duration for the entire training series? The timing of activities will be important. We talked in last week's session about how BJA requires that applicants give the fiscal year and quarter for each objective and deliverable. But in addition to this, the solicitation also calls for applicants to include a project timeline. Now, the timeline does not count towards the 15-page limit. It provides a great opportunity for the applicant to not only outline the key task and milestone, but also to really prove that they have thought this through, the details of their activities, and set realistic deadlines in which they can be accomplished. As stated in previous sessions, there is a required 3-month planning period and phased approach at the beginning of the project. So make sure you're taking this into account and the activities that might need to happen during this time period. Your timeline should reflect this planning period. All applicants need to include working with BJA training and technical assistance, or TTA, provider on meeting benchmarks such as logic model, partnership formation, and sustainability planning during this planning phase time period. Other examples of activities that might occur during this beginning period of the project will vary based on project, but might include things like finalizing your MOU, securing contracts for services or systems, completing any type of pre-work that might be required for implementation of a technology system, or policy and procedure development. This planning period should ultimately show that you are creating the foundation for a successful implementation and helping to identify and mitigate any risk and ensure that your program will be effectively implemented. The last piece in this work plan here is the performance indicator, which is the far right column on the work plan. Performance indicators are measurable metrics to monitor how effectively your project's activities are being executed and track overall project progress towards your goals and objectives. Now, the specific indicators you will use will be dependent on your project, your activities, the deliverable area which you are addressing. BJA does not require applicants to submit performance data with your application, but if awarded, recipients must collect and report on performance measures to OJP. You can find a link to this list of performance measures on page 17 of the solicitation. So you want to be thinking about the metrics and indicators that you are going to use to track your project's progress in relationship to these required OJP performance measures for the solicitation. So for example, projects providing training and education will track metrics such as the number of trainings delivered, the number of people trained, the impact of the training, and a project implementing technology reporting system will report on the types of digital platforms implemented, such as smartphones, hotlines, etc. In the plan for data collection section of the narrative, you will describe how you will collect data, monitor projects, make adjustments, and communicate results with stakeholders. Additionally, your narrative should include detail or show how your project aligns with and furthers your broader safety goals, which are outlined in your comprehensive school safety plan. Make sure you're helping reviewers see that this project is already part of a bigger plan. We already have some buy-in and commitment, resources focused on these areas, or however you might align with this broader plan. This will just help bolster competitiveness of your proposal and show districts' work towards maximizing impact, collaboration, and long-term sustainability. Okay, so now I have discussed the general things here that you need to be thinking about in your project design as you begin to break it down into a work plan. The next layer I want to add on here is the deliverable areas. So depending on which deliverable area you select, there may be requirements that you need to follow in designing your program and explaining it in your narrative section. This information is detailed in full in the solicitation, but I want to talk through some of the requirements of each of these areas and what it might mean for the project design section of the narrative. And before I jump into these areas, I just want to add that in your narrative, you'll want to make it explicitly clear which area you are addressing. It's a good idea to use language directly from the solicitation, such as, our project will implement an anonymous reporting system as a technology solution. And if you're addressing multiple areas, make sure you are distinguishing between the different areas and activities so that is clear to the reviewer. As I said earlier, there are different requirements and different components for different areas, so you really just need to detail these out. In other words, you don't want to be lumping all of your deliverable areas and activities together. Area 1, as I said, is technology solutions, such as an anonymous reporting system. If you're addressing this area, you must detail in your narrative your plan to not only implement this system, but the additional things that might need to happen, including proper reporting and follow-up. Describe how you will ensure data privacy, security, and fairness, including how you will analyze the data to ensure there is no disparate impact. Think about implementation strategies, policies, and protocols needed to address student privacy, data security, race, national origin, disability, religion, and sex-based discrimination and bias. What types of applications will be implemented with the system? Will this include apps on smartphones, hotlines, and/or website? Remember that the interventions and strategies should always be trauma-informed and informed by adult and child development. I've included a link at the bottom of this slide on strategies and resources to support trauma-informed schools. Additionally, projects need to ensure that community stakeholders, again, are a part of the planning process. And this is true not only for projects implementing technology systems, but also in other areas that I'll get to next, including behavioral threat assessments and intervention teams, or virtual reality training. Practices and strategies around this engagement are described in further detail in the U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center's document titled Enhancing School Safety Using a Threat Assessment Model. The link to this document is provided here on this slide. And when implementing technology, you also need to consider training. Technically, anyone who could come forward with concerning information or might be involved in the assessment process should be provided with training on topics like type of information that should be brought forward, how individuals can report concerns, how information will be collected, followed up on, and kept confidential. Any programs providing training need to take into consideration the audience. Who needs the training and what training do they need? For example, Students might need training on where and how to report concerns, the information that should be reported, and reassurance that their reports will remain anonymous and kept confidential. While staff and adults in the school might need training related to threat assessment, who should be notified, sharing of information, and steps to safely intervene. In addition to training, think about how you might promote the new technology system with any advertising, email blast, or events like assemblies and parent nights. And remember that all technology must be consistent with best practices for school safety, including applicable standards for school safety established by a federal or state government agency, such as the Student Online Personal Protection Act of 2019, any findings and recommendations of public commissions and task force established to make recommendations or set standards for school security, and compliance with all applicable codes, including building and life safety codes. Applicants proposing technological enhancements can receive priority consideration if they address factors pertaining to digital trust, including safeguarding privacy and ensuring civil rights and civil liberties are protected. This would include strategies to ensure careful implementation of new systems, such as trainings, just like I've talked about, establishing policies to govern the use of the new technology, and ongoing monitoring to ensure the system is used safely and responsibly. It is important to take all this into consideration as you're designing your program. Make sure you describe in your narrative how your project will comply with the best practices of data security. And if you are addressing the components of priority consideration, this must be demonstrated throughout your activity, throughout your application, including activities that are outlined within the project design and implementation section. It might include staff training on the new technology that's going to be implemented, who will be trained, the training needs of the group, the training method, will it be virtual or in person, and the timeline, will it be completed prior to the implementation of the system? Will there be follow-up trainings? And then lastly, if you are proposing to implement an anonymous reporting system in a state or jurisdiction that already has an existing anonymous reporting system, you will need to describe how the proposed system will not be duplicative and be aware of any of the unallowable uses of OJP funds pertaining to technology. OJP grant funds may not be used for any equipment, system, or service that uses covered telecommunications equipment or services as a substantial or essential component of any system, or as critical technology as part of any system. In general, this includes telecommunications and video surveillance equipment or services produced by a foreign entity. You will want to see the solicitation and the DOJ grants financial guide for full details. And the next area, if your district wants to implement behavioral threat assessment or BTA teams, these teams must be interdisciplinary, and thus you must include coordination with law enforcement agency, behavioral health specialist, community stakeholders, and school personnel. You must demonstrate in your project design and implementation narrative the support of these partners. This should also be demonstrated through letters of support and MOUs. I'll talk more on actual letters and MOUs later in this presentation, but the important thing to note here is that your project must include these partners on your team, and in your narrative, you should be describing these partners, their role, and providing proof that they have been and will continue to be involved. Think about who will be represented on the BTA team or intervention team. How will they be involved in project planning, How will they be engaged in ongoing efforts such as risk assessment, incident response, data sharing, and school and community outreach? BTA must also be done in conjunction with a research partner or evaluator who will track the data pertaining to the use of the BTA, the demographic characteristics of those who undergo assessments, and the referral results of those assessments. The documentation of services provided after each assessment, and the review of data and deviations to ensure follow-up and no disparate impact based on race, ethnicity, or disability. All of this work in the research must be described in your program design section and included in your timeline and potentially reflected in your budget if that is appropriate for your project. So for example, your timeline should include key activities for an evaluator, such as securing a contract during the planning phase with the evaluator, the plans for collecting the above data, reporting and reviewing this data. Also keep in mind here that the performance data that will be required, as I mentioned earlier, such as the number of students needing and receiving assessments, or the number of crisis interventions responded to, and the types of individuals that will be represented on your team. Again, you can see the full list of OJP performance measures detailing out this information. Area 3 is training for school personnel to improve school climate. When addressing this area, applicants really should be providing training for school officials on intervening and responding to individuals in mental health crises, delivering social emotional learning, bullying prevention, and suicide prevention, improving access to school-based behavioral health services, and/or other types of evidence-based programs that promote a positive and healthy school climate. The project design and implementation section of the narrative must describe your trainings and include strategies that are trauma-informed, protect student privacy rights, and involve mental health professionals at all stages of training and in practices. Training should take into consideration different audiences and have a broader impact. So how will you involve law enforcement officers in trainings or staff from local mental health agencies or potentially from youth service organizations? You want to describe how your trainings will reach the broader community with the same consistent messaging on school safety. Describe your plan for training, which should not be a one-time training, but should be an ongoing, continuous effort that builds professional development, increases participant knowledge and understanding around practices, tools, and strategies that will ultimately help you reach your goals and objectives of improving school safety and school climate. Describe how you will track your progress to ensure you are reaching these objectives. Remember that regardless of which deliverable area you are applying under, it is crucial to make sure your narrative is again lining with your logic model and your work plan. Additionally, for projects improving school climate, describe the ways in which students will be engaged in your project, from conception to implementation and evaluation. So perhaps you might conduct focus groups or town halls to give students the opportunity to express their opinions, or perhaps create a student committee who will be involved in decision making. Or you might want to engage student leaders in some type of anti-bullying campaigns or developing promotional materials. This not only helps to increase buy-in, but can also help create some internal champions so that you can help mitigate any unintended effects of the project. When you think about the impact of your activities, it is important to consider unintended effects. For example, a mental health awareness campaign could inadvertently stigmatize mental health concerns or could create misunderstandings that might discourage students from seeking help. An intense campaign or messaging could seem overwhelming to some students and create more anxiety or stress. As you design your project, you want to be mindful of potential unintended consequences. The best way to mitigate is through trauma-informed approaches and seeking input from diverse perspectives. Listen to the voices of your students, parents, teachers, support and admin staff, your community members. Consider what-if scenarios. If we do this, what could happen? Your narrative should highlight any trauma-informed practices that are being used or will be used. Schoolsafety.gov provides good additional resources on supporting trauma-informed approaches in schools. Area 4 is specialized training for law enforcement officers who work in schools and/or with school-age populations. The solicitation details out specific training topic areas that should or can be included in your projects, such as mental health awareness, conflict resolution, crisis intervention, youth development, trauma-informed care, family and parent engagement, multi-tiered systems of support, and more, which again are detailed in the solicitation. It may also include non-training activities such as policy development on appropriate uses of force, policy development and training to identify school disciplinary issues, use of student data, conflict resolution, and more. In your narrative, you must describe in detail the training activities and the method of delivery. Describe how your training plan will be ongoing and how you will collect feedback from participants to inform your training curriculum and measure progress. Explain how this will equip specific individuals who will be trained, such as school resource officers or probation officers, with the knowledge and skills needed to effectively address safety challenges and create a safe and supportive learning environment. Area 5 is hiring school support personnel, and the narrative must include the plan for hiring, onboarding, and training, along with retaining and sustaining positions beyond the life of the grant. The new hires can be part of a co-responder model, or they can work independently in the school. All of this work needs to be reflected in your activities and timeline. Take into consideration any specific qualifications and trainings required prior to hire or after hiring. If working as part of a co-responder model, this needs to be taken into consideration, including how you will do joint training. You may want to include time in the planning phase for some of this work. The goal is that your new hires are fully prepared to begin working with students and your identified target population once you hit the implementation phase. As I've talked in previous sessions, these funds cannot be used to hire new school resource officers. They can be used to pay overtime for existing school resource officers who are performing duties beyond their normal daily duties. Now remember, if you are going to do this, it needs to be evident in your narrative that this overtime pay is for work extending beyond current responsibilities and outside of their normal daily duties. You will want to think through how and where this needs to be reflected in your proposal, including the project design section where you're describing exactly what the individual will do and how it's outside of their scope of work, current scope of work. Also in your budget and potentially other attachments. Area 6 is for projects proposing community violence intervention strategies. Narrative here should show how you are partnering with community-based organizations and community violence intervention practitioners and that you will incorporate the BJA Community-Based Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative, or the CVI-PI checklist. Community violence intervention is an approach that uses evidence-based strategies to reduce violence. The CVI-PI checklist, which is linked here on this slide, provides a framework for program development that is based around guiding principles, including community-centered, equitable and inclusive, evidence-informed, and effective and sustainable solutions. It includes working with the community stakeholders and partners, including a research partner. Narrative should describe your community violence intervention approach and incorporate the elements of this checklist into your project. Deliverable Area 7 is for projects seeking to implement simulation-based experiential learning, in which your trainings must be fully immersive, virtual reality-based technology training to improve responses to school incidents such as bullying and other class management scenarios. This may not include any simulations for law enforcement or school responsive to active shooter training. You must include a research partner to assist in the training development, monitoring, and evaluation. In your narrative, you will need to describe how you will design a fully immersive, hands-on experience in realistic school environments and scenarios that will walk participants through making real-time decisions. You may also want to include pre-brief and debrief meetings to reflect on the experience and deepen learning for participants. Demonstrate how this work will be done with a research partner, from planning and designing all the way through implementation and evaluation. Evaluating progress to inform future iterations and measure effectiveness will be important to show. You will want to show that your trainees will generate a heightened sense of awareness and ability to recognize potential threats, improve complex decision-making skills, and increase their confidence in handling these types of situations. And remember that any applications proposing virtual reality training, behavioral threat assessment or intervention teams, and technology solutions should ensure that their implementation strategies, policies, and protocols address critical issues such as student privacy, data security, race, national origin, disability, religion, and sex-based discrimination and bias. And Deliverable Area 5 is projects that include partnering with local law enforcement to develop information sharing practices and protocols. Narrative here should describe how you will develop practices and protocols that allow law enforcement, school practitioners, community-based service providers, and others to regularly share information around violent crimes outside the school environment, such as shootings or homicides that may impact a student's behavioral health and well-being in school. You should describe a Handle with Care program that is trauma-informed, cross-systems, and collaborative to ensure timely, appropriate interventions for these students and opportunities to build their resilience. Your narrative should describe a plan to develop practices and protocols around the sharing of critical information. What type of system will be used? The communication plan, including protocols for notifying parents, staff, and others, as well as ongoing communication and collaboration between the school and local law enforcement. Important things to consider here, again, are data privacy and confidentiality protocols. How will you ensure student information is protected and in full compliance with the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, and any other laws and regulations? Also, take into consideration not only the development of practices and protocols, but any training and education of law enforcement and staff that needs to occur on these data sharing practices and protocols. Under the last deliverable area, applicants should describe the school-based assessment services that will be delivered in order to evaluate students for mental health disorders and treatment services that will be provided to those experiencing mental health disorders. Describe evidence-based assessment tools that will be used, the individuals who will conduct the assessments, and if any training is needed. Discuss in detail the mental health services that will be delivered by qualified individuals, who will receive the services, and how this work will help carry out the project goals and objectives. A key element of these projects is the use of evidence-based programs and strategies. One place to find evidence-based programs and practices is crimesolutions.gov. The link is provided here on this slide. Crimesolutions.gov provides a database or program strategies and procedures that have been screened, reviewed, and rated based on either evaluations or meta-analysis that synthesize the different evaluations. These programs and practices are rated on a continuum of effectiveness, which tells us how certain we can be of the outcomes. There are 4 categories in this continuum. Number 1, effective. These are programs and practices that have strong evidence to indicate they achieve the outcomes when implemented with fidelity, which means the degree to which the model is being followed. Promising is the next level. These are programs and practices that have some evidence to indicate they are achieving outcomes, but would benefit from additional research. Likewise, the 4th category is inclusive evidence, in which programs and practices were determined to have inconclusive evidence for a rating to be assigned. And last is no effect. These are programs that have strong evidence they did not have the intended effect or potentially had a harmful effect when trying to achieve the outcomes. So for the purposes of BJA, you really want to be focusing on those programs and practices in the effective category, which have high evidence levels of success. Make sure you are citing the name of the evidence-based practice and including any sources in your narrative. The logic model can also be another great place for you to identify those evidence-based strategies. You may also want to highlight in your narrative key findings from the research and positive impacts of the practices or interventions that directly correlate to your identified needs, activities, and goals, and show how you will implement the practice or program and ensure fidelity. The bottom line here is that you really want to give the funder confidence. Yes, we are using evidence-based practices, programs, and approaches, and here is how we will do it. I have stressed throughout these presentations the importance of collaboration and partnerships, and reviewers will be looking for this evidence throughout your narrative and attachments like your MOUs, your letters of support, and potentially even your budget. So I think it's really important to talk about what is needed in both your narrative and your letters of support and MOUs to ensure there is a consistent alignment across all of your documents in your proposal. And I said this in one of the last sessions, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to begin this process early on, because this is an area where often writers have the least control over, like when you might get an MOU returned from a partner. Now, there are specific elements that need to be included in the MOUs and the letters of support as outlined in the solicitation. The key elements that need to be included in an MOU are the purpose of the MOU, including who is entering the agreement, the effective date of the agreement, its purpose, and keep in mind that the date must cover the term of the award or contain language regarding the annual renewal of the agreement. description of the partner roles and responsibilities, and assurance that each partner will protect student privacy and ensure that students are not discriminated against based on race, national origin, disability, religion, or sex. Any budget information, such as specific funds allocated to other partners for the stated purpose of these funds. And signatures and dates from the school officials who will have general project oversight and decision-making authority. This might be the board chair or superintendent, and then the leading official from the partnering entity. For local law enforcement, this might be the sheriff or chief of police. Letters of support must include a description of the relationship between the applicant entity and the supporting entity, a description of the need and what benefits will be gained in the project, and a description of the applicant's capacity to complete the proposed project. Now, your narrative must align with the information in these MOUs and letters. In your project design section, make it clear who your key partners are, what their roles are, and the benefits of this collaboration, including coordinated efforts and shared resources. One thing to note here is that BJA will allow you to submit a draft MOU. This draft must include the above information and the names and titles of the parties that will be signing the document. Then you would want to build in your project timeline and make it clear in your narrative that this MOU will be finalized during the planning phase. I've covered a lot of detail on the components that need to be included in the project design and implementation section of your narrative. So let me summarize the key takeaways here. Number one, make sure the purpose of your project is clear. Here are the solutions we are proposing to address this problem, and here's how we'll do it. Address the key questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how. Next, show the alignment between the identified needs to the activities, goals, objectives, and requested funds. And make sure this is in alignment with BJA's goals and objectives. Include detail on how your project aligns with and furthers your broader safety goals outlined in your comprehensive school safety plan. Help reviewers see this project is part of a bigger overall plan. We already have some buy-in, commitment, resources focused, and this will only bolster our project and further maximize the impact of this project, as well as collaboration and long-term sustainability. Provide a timeline and make sure to include the 3-month planning phase for key activities. Make sure the timeline is realistic and within the funding period. Activities are expected to start after award. Identify evidence-based programs or practices to be implemented. Show that you will use a trauma-informed approach. Demonstrate how you plan to coordinate and collaborate with local partners, including local law enforcement. What roles will the partners play, and how will this benefit the project and the participants? Remember that if you're proposing virtual reality training, behavioral threat assessments or intervention teams, and operating technology solutions, you must ensure that your strategies, policies, and protocols will address critical issues such as student privacy, data security, race, national origin, disability, religion, and sex-based discrimination and bias. And finally, if you're seeking priority consideration, make sure this is clear in your project design section. Describe the activities that will be done to address the key components of digital trust, and make sure this is clear throughout the narrative, not just in the program design section, but perhaps your timeline and budget if there are associated costs. As we've done in the previous sessions, I am providing an additional homework assignment with this session. You will receive a blank work plan template. I encourage you to invest time in developing out this work plan to help you start drafting your project design and implementation section. By taking the time to do this, you can help increase the quality of your proposal and show a well-developed, thought-out project plan. Thank you for joining me in another training session on the BJA Stop School Violence Grant Program as we've explored in depth the project design section of the narrative. By understanding these key requirements and elements and following the described best practices, you can help create a strong foundation for your program. I look forward to seeing you again for our last and final training on the budget. Thank you for your time and continued effort and commitment to make a positive difference in your school community.